Hello, it's time for another Wargame Soldiers and Strategy painting tutorial. And this week we are going to talk about how you can paint figures with a lot of metal on them. Last week we covered painting black, so I thought it would be good if we moved on to another sort of color-inspired technique video. And we're going to be demonstrating that on this little guy right here. This is from the Perry Plastics War of the Roses box set, or I don't know, maybe there's actually multiple sets now, I'm not sure, but he's from one of those boxes, and I just put him together. And he's sort of one of the command figures, one of the knights or nobles, so he's wearing a lot of armor. He has basically full plate on, so I thought, you know, is there really any better way to demonstrate how you can paint a lot of metal on a figure than somebody like this? So that's what we're going to look at. And you can see I've also put him together as a bannerman here. He's got a big long spear, and that's meant to hold a flag. So he's a noble bannerman, a noble standard bearer, and later on, not in this video, but later, then we're going to talk about how you can make a flag for him. But first we'll just work on the metal. And just really quick, I'll just go over what we did on him already. Hello! As usual, I cleaned him up and then I painted him with black enamel paint. And after that, I went ahead and did his face, and I did that the way I described in some earlier videos, basically with the foundry flesh triad and some of the techniques I've talked about already. I've also painted his hair, and I used a foundry spear shaft triad to do that. So he's all ready to go, and so now we can just go ahead and get started and focus on painting the metal bits.
Okay, so I'm starting out here by applying a base coat to the entire figure, and I've made that by mixing Runefang steel, which is from Citadel paints, with the charcoal black medium color from Foundry, and I'm just going to paint that over the entire figure. It's really important when you're making a base coat for metal that you choose a nice dark shade, darker than you would normally expect it to be, and make sure that you can't just use a normal metallic color without a normal paint mixed into it, because otherwise it just won't have good enough coverage, because metallic paints are really transparent. They don't have high pigment density, so to get a good base coat on your figure and your metal areas, you need to first mix the metallic with a solid color, and and that's what I'm doing here, and you can see I've just basically applied it on top of the entire figure like this. So once you've finished base coating the figure, the next step is to apply a very heavy wash to it, and I'm using Bada Block, or sorry, it's not Bada Block, it's Nolan Oil now, excuse me, the color name changed, and I am applying a very heavy wash to the figure. The heavier, the better in this case. You really want to get down in the cracks. The only thing, just make sure you don't get on the upper surfaces. You want to avoid pooling, of course, or blobs of black, so smooth that away. But otherwise, just really put a really solid coat of a black wash onto your entire figure. So the next phase in painting this guy is the most involved and time-consuming. And what we're going to do once the wash is dry is begin carefully layering the Runefang steel on all the areas of the armor, which in this case is a lot. You want to thin down your paint a fair amount when you're doing this. You don't want it too thick. You want nice flowing layers. As I mentioned before, the pigment concentration of metallic paints is not as high as in normal paints, which can be problematic in some situations, but in this case it's really a good thing, because it means we can put on nice, smooth, thin layers. So what you want to do is really just apply it all over the model, except, as you can see, what I'm not doing, I'm not putting it in the crack, so I'm being careful where there's lines or breaks in the armor not to apply any of the silver paint. So it's a little bit like sort of the traditional model painting technique of painting a figure black and then just sort of leaving it black around the edges. It's kind of like that. So you just have to carefully go over the whole figure, and this step is very time consuming, because I mean, on a model like this especially, of course, because there's just so much surface area that's metal, and in this case with this kind of plate armor, there's so many different, sub pieces that you have to paint over. So once you've applied the metal to every area of the armor, it's time to go back over it again. And in this case, you don't need to try and apply the paint to every single area of the armor, but it's really just about going over the areas that you need to be extra shiny. Like, well, you can see, like, I'm paying special attention there to the knees and the shins, areas that are really at the front of the figure where a lot of light's going to hit. You want to go over those extra with the paint the feet too, you can see. And the rest you don't have to pay so much attention to. The other thing you want to be looking for is areas where the paint didn't cover very smoothly, because, as I said, that's the problem with this sort of the thinness, transparency of the metallic paints. You don't always get very even coverage in the first pass. So you have to look for areas where it's sort of, you can see kind of thinness, or sort of some of the black or gray underneath is showing through too much, and kind of go over that again and smooth it out. And you can also, what I did also before I started on this was, after I'd applied the first layer, I also looked at sort of the lines, the cracks in the armor, and I looked for places where maybe I'd been a little bit sloppy and some of the silver paint had gotten down into the crevices, and that's not very hard to correct. All you have to do is take some sort of thinned down dark gray or black paint and very carefully just go into the crevices, and you can fix it very easily. And in fact, you can even sort of use that, if it's thin, to shade a little bit in areas where you want it a little bit darker after you've applied your metal base coat. So I've now finished going back over the areas with Ruined Fang steel that I wanted to be extra bright and extra smooth, and now I'm taking Vallejo Silver, which I thinned down quite a bit, and I am now applying that on areas that I want to be really, really shiny and really bright, really just as that extra highlight, like on the chest and on the shoulder pads, on the knees, on the shins, all of those areas. And Vallejo paints, metallic paints, are particularly thin and transparent and have very poor pigmentation, particularly, and they can be kind of difficult to work with. And they tend to come out of the bottle like really, really thick, and you really have to thin them down a lot to make them flow. And usually, by the time you thin them down enough that they actually flow, they have become so transparent that they really don't work very well. And that's especially true with the silver. I found the silver paint is very bad for that. But in this case, because I'm really just trying to add extra, very subtle shine to certain areas, it's not as bad as it possibly could be. So I'm just putting it on the armor. I pay special attention to the blades of the weapons. When you're painting like the sword and the spear tip, you just want to apply sort of the really high highlight to one half of the sword blade. You can kind of see how there's a line down the middle, and if you look at it, whichever side looks shiniest to you when the light hits it, you should emphasize that by putting the silver highlight on it. You can kind of see how I'm doing that, but I'm only really doing it on just one side, and that will give it a more realistic effect later on. So now that all of the metal highlighting is complete, the final stage of painting the armor is to fine line it. You really wouldn't have to do this, and it is actually kind of a pain, but I think it looks kind of good. The trick with fine lining metals like this is that you can't really fine line them with just pure metallic pigment because of the problems we mentioned earlier. The paints are just too transparent, and you would end up having to go back over the lines over and over again, and that would be really annoying because nobody wants to have to do fine lining more than one time. So in order to avoid that, you can fine line it with a just normal standard non-metallic pigment and just mix a little bit of metallic into it to get it a little sparkly, and that'll basically work too. Then you get the coverage that you need. In this case, I've taken a Vallejo, I'm trying to think what it is. It's like a light sky gray or storm gray. I can't remember. It's a light silver gray. That's it. I'm using Vallejo light silver gray, which is a very light silver color that looks almost metallic or sort of pearl-like on its own. And I mix some Vallejo silver into that to make it even more shiny, so you get a nice kind of slightly opalescent color. And I'm going over that and using it to edge all of the places on the armor. And I don't worry about doing it everywhere, like underneath his legs and stuff, but everywhere where it's really obvious. And because it's got that extra coverage, you'll see it'll show up against the metal really well. And I'm also using it sort of on high highlight areas there, like you see on the knee, and sort of blending it a little bit so that you get areas that'll make those areas look almost white. So it'll look really like there's a lot of light hitting it, so you can kind of blend that to get some other nice effects going. I use it on the blades to make a line down the middle of the swords, and I use it on the edges of the blades and stuff to make that makes for a really nice extra fine sort of detail that will really end up making the metal areas of your figure pop out. So now I'm just going to finish up all the details on the figure, and I'm going to start out by painting sort of the leather areas, the straps and the belt and stuff, and the scabbard on the sort of the dagger that this guy has. And I'm going to use a foundry triad again. I'm using Conquer Brown, and I'm just going to very, very straightforwardly just apply that in layers, and it goes really, really quickly. And then really brilliantly, I noticed sort of halfway through painting the belts that there was like this sort of gap on the left side of it, and it just hadn't occurred to me before, and I thought, that's not right, and I realized, oh crap, there's supposed to be a sword scabbard there, so I had to stop and attach that. So I went ahead and added the scabbard, and I painted it using the Foundry Bay Brown triad, and I applied that also sort of the grip of his sword and of his dagger. And now what I'm doing is I'm going back over and doing sort of the shiny brass gold accents on his scabbard and his belt and on his sword. And for that I'm using some Vallejo bronze as a base coat, which I have mixed with some of the darkest color of Bay Brown. And you always want to, with a bronze gold base coat, you always want to go way darker than you think you need, so get it really nice and brown as your initial base coat. And then once you're done putting the base coat on the gold, you can go back over it with just straight gold. This was a Citadel gold color. I forget exactly the shade, but you could use Vallejo gold thinned down, and that would work just fine. And that and that sort of adds the sort of middle highlight to those gold areas. And then I put a final highlight on the gold areas using kind of counterintuitively silver. I found that the trick that I used for fine lining silver and steel things doesn't work very well on the gold colors, but silver paint, and that's this thin down Vallejo Silver, works great. So just use it very sparingly, sort of on the tops of things and on sort of the edges where you really want a light highlight, and make it thin so it doesn't look more silver than it does gold. So now I'm just painting the spear shaft with Foundry, with the Foundry spear shaft triad, and I'm after the initial base coat, I'm just layering on the medium and light shades. There's no strong directional light here, so you need to apply a lot of thin layers and just gradually build it up so it doesn't look like there's too sharp of a dividing line between one color on any particular side. And I'm just making it a little stronger on the bottom where the spear would be worn. And I'm also working on the hat, which I think I base coated with Citadel Corn Red, and I am now highlighting it using, I think, Evil Sun's Scarlet. But I'm just using two colors here. I'm keeping it nice and simple, and just making the colors thin, and just kind of working out of the hat. And making the hat intentionally bright is a really nice contrast with all of the kind of simple metal that I've got on the rest of the figure. So now I'm just finishing off the figure by applying I forget the color. Anyway, the Citadel blue wash to the sword blade and spear tip, because that's a good way to sort of set it apart from the normal armor, which doesn't have that color and kind of look like blued steel. So I'm just putting that on the dark side of the blade and sort of at the base very carefully. And you can always use washes on metal colors to give them a slightly different effect, and they always work really well. The color shows up very easily, so be careful to be very sparing with this, because you don't want your sword obviously to look bright blue, because we're not painting a fantasy figure here. So take it easy and keep your wash really, really watered down, and you can go back over it a couple of times, which is what I'm doing here, to slowly build up the color without kind of overwhelming things. So now that's the figure. He's pretty much done. We've done everything. And here you can see this is just the flag that comes in the Perry box set, and I'm kind of showing you how that looks on the figure. And in the next video we're going to talk about how you can make your own flag, which looks even better. So like this video, comment, share, and I will see you next time on the War Games Soldiers and Strategy painting tutorial video series.